Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Well, here we are now on day 78 of the second Donald Trump presidency, and we are on the precipice of a trade war that has no precedent in modern history. Trump's saying that starting tonight at midnight, the U.S. will tax imports from China at a rate of 104%, an announcement that sent stock markets back into free fall as everyone contemplates the world's two biggest trading partners bringing global commerce to a halt. Now, basically, every economist across the spectrum, with maybe a few exceptions, thinks this is a disaster. The conservative opinion writers of the Wall Street Journal, who helped elect Donald Trump twice, are absolutely freaking the F out that Donald Trump is killing free trade in the American economy. Even Trump's unelected co-president, Elon Musk, is reportedly pleading with Trump in private to reverse course on the tariffs. While publicly he's fighting online with Peter Navarro, Trump's top trade advisor and the architect of Trump's tariff plans. Musk called him a moron. He called him dumber than a sack of bricks and worse. Amid all this, there has been this desperate, almost kind of pathological search for some sort of reason at the core of Trump's policy here. And so you're seeing the MAGA faithful spin this in the media. They've created, and not just them, I think some in the mainstream media as well, they've created this kind of alternate steelman version of what Trump is doing, where what he's trying to do is recreate the middle-class economy of the post-World War II boom years that many people have genuine nostalgia for, because it was the best time for certain folks, I mean, particularly white folks without college degrees, to enter the middle class. You had a strong, growing industrial manufacturing base, meant those folks could get union jobs, paid a good wage, had benefits in healthcare, send their kids to college. You had huge home production, right? And the 30-year mortgage, you could buy a home cheaply. And again, there's a reason that people across the political spectrum, I mean, liberals, conservatives, everyone in between, tend to hearken back to the days of high union density, low inequality, a growing middle class. It really was good for a lot of people. So, again, the charitable argument, and you're seeing this everywhere. Once we hear this, you'll see it, for what Trump wants here, the reason that he's started a global trade war that may very well impoverish the whole world and the U.S., that what he wants to do is go back to the heyday of the 1960s, the Wonder Years opening credits, and who doesn't want that? But here's the thing, and I cannot stress this strongly enough. That is absolutely not what he is doing. It's complete wish casting, because he keeps telling us what his actual goals are here.
The country was at the richest point in its history in the 1890s. It was all tariffs. If you looked at William McKinley as an example, he was a big tariff president.
In the words of a very great but highly underrated president, William McKinley, I am a tariff man standing on a tariff platform.
If you look at some of McKinley's words, he was very beautiful.
From 1789 to 1913, we were a tariff-backed nation, and the United States was proportionately the wealthiest it has ever been. Then in 1913, for reasons unknown to mankind, they established the income tax so that citizens, rather than foreign countries, would start paying the money necessary to run our government.
The foreign countries don't pay the tariffs! But that aside, as you can see from that nice montage we put together, it's not about the 1950s, it's not about the 1960s, it's not boomer nostalgia, it's not the Wonder Years. It is quite explicitly about taking us back to the 1890s, to pre-1913, to William McKinley. He said it on the campaign trail over and over and over again. He said it on the day he announced the tariffs to the world. He is also very clear and consistent about why. The President of the United States, and again, he said this many times, just hopes this $6 trillion tax hike he is unilaterally slapping on you via all imports to the U.S., most of which will be paid by working middle class and poor folks, will raise revenue he can then use to hand over to the billionaires by either massively cutting income taxes or getting rid of them altogether. It is a plan economists call unrealistic, unattainable, bad math. It would be wildly regressive. But even if the math could work, think about it. Again, the period he thinks is the golden era, the heyday he's returning to, is the Gilded Age. And tariffs are the way to get there. And part of the reason it is such a just idiotic, destructive, insane idea, and no one can really actually upset that's what he wants, even though that's what he's telling us. It's like the opposite of Morning in America, right? A shining city on a hill, in America of the future. You want to know what that era was about? Rampant tuberculosis in tenement slums, non-existent public services, poor sewage, heavy industrial pollution, robber barons lording their insane wealth over everyone. No one but, like, billionaires could possibly want that. I mean, they did build a bunch of nice houses in Newport, Rhode Island, but... And what about those manufacturing jobs, right? Isn't it all worth it if it brings heavy industries back to the United States? Maybe to factory owners, possibly, for workers? Again, we're not talking about high-paying unionized assembly line jobs of the 1950s, 60s here. So don't think GM. Think Triangle Shirtwaist Factory of the early 1900s. Or, you know, the 21st century version, I guess, as described by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
Trillions of dollars of factories are going to be built in America. That's huge GDP. The factories being built in America are huge.
That takes
GDP.
years. And you've said that robots are going to fill
us.
those jobs. So those aren't union
it's really automated
jobs.
It's automated factories, but the key is who's going to build the factories, who's going to operate the factories, who's going to make them work. Great American workers. The army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones, that kind of thing is going to come to America. It's going to be automated, and great Americans, the trade craft of America, is going to fix them, is going to work on them.
Bro, what are you talking about? That's the vision? That's a vision. It's honestly too self-contradictory to call it a vision. The screwing of the little screws will be in America, millions of people doing it, but it will be automated, and then the great American workers will be proudly fixing the robots that do the screwing? Who's getting screwed? If you err on the side of taking it all seriously, which again, it takes some effort, or believing that Trump wants to see this through and cause a global trade war and send us back to the 1890s, which I think is where we're at. The only thing that can stop it right now is probably Congress. And what's surprising is it looks like it might be starting to move a little bit in that direction. Today, senators from both parties got to grill Trump's trade representative, and Republicans did not hold back.
Who pays these high tariffs? In the short, medium term, it will be the consumer. It'll be the consumer. And so I'm worried about the inflationary effect. I'm worried if there is a trade war, that we're going to have markets shutting down for American farmers.
I don't often agree with the members on the other side of the aisle, but in many cases here today, particularly when they're expressing concern about small businesses in their states, I'm hoping you're very, and I hope you and the president are very sensitive about companies potentially going bankrupt by these actions.
Whose throat do I get to choke if this proves to be wrong?
That last senator there, that's Tom Tillis in North Carolina. He's up for re-election in a swing state. He's also one of 7 Republican senators who are now backing a bipartisan bill that would require Congress to approve President Trump's tariffs on trading partners. Under that bill, sponsored by Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa and Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington, any tariffs imposed by the president would expire after 60 days unless Congress voted to approve them.
Trump's man-made economic crisis, the one that currently threatens the life savings of Americans from coast to coast and all across the ideological spectrum, is straining even the most reality-challenged corners of his once airtight grip on the information landscape. The Dow today started out positive, only for the rally to fizzle. The Dow ended the day down more than 300 points. Stocks plunged after the White House announced that there will be no reprieve on tariffs for China. A whopping rate of 104% would be imposed on imports from China starting at midnight tonight. Donald Trump's tariff stink bomb is causing all sorts of economic and political chaos. It has even strained the relationship between Donald Trump and his co-president Elon Musk. Sources telling the Washington Post this, quote, over the weekend, as Elon Musk launched into a barrage of social media posts criticizing one of the lead White House advisors for President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff plan, Musk was going over that same official's head and making personal appeals to Trump. The attempted intervention has not brought success so far. Elon Musk's feud with that advisor, Peter Navarro, continued today. Musk calling Navarro, quote, dumber than a sack of bricks, end quote, and a, quote, moron, after the other guy, Navarro, dismissed Elon Musk as not a manufacturer, but a, quote, car assembler in a CNBC interview with the third Trump guy, Joe Kernan, who, as of right now, sounds pretty skeptical of the tariff plan. Take a listen.
They're much bigger. I think they're much bigger than most people thought. And I think from policy institutes on both sides of the aisle, the methodology that was used has been universally derided as being non-serious. I think you'd have to concede that this was not the market reaction you were looking for. There's a way of maybe incrementally trying to accomplish some of the things that the president wants to do in a reasonable, serious way. And this just almost across the board has caused what you're seeing in the stock market and a lot of head scratching and head shaking on whether anyone really knows what they're doing in this case, Peter.
It's the stupid, right? As the old political axiom goes. Well, that feeling that nobody knows what they're doing in the Trump administration is the predominant view on Wall Street, even among Trump supporters who have a direct line to Trump or top Trump aides. Brand new reporting in the New York Times reveals that an all-hands-on-deck effort to persuade anyone in the Trump administration to back down from the tariffs has failed. From that report, quote, the day after the president announced his most sweeping round of tariffs last week, chief executives from major banks, including Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, had a private meeting with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. It was organized by a lobbying group in Washington. But Lutnick was not persuaded to reverse course. Over the weekend, mega donors to Trump's re-election effort tried a different tack, pleading their case in calls to Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Those efforts also came up empty. New York Times reports that much of the conversation now centers around protecting themselves from the worst effects of Trump's trade war, which even some Trump allies now say will lead to a recession. Fox Business host Maria Bartiromo, who went all in on Trump's 2020 election lies, which she said in doing that, along with a few of her other colleagues at Fox, cost that network $787 million. But even she, of $787 million fame, cannot brush off the reality of Trump's tariff disaster. Watch this.
It is going to have an effect on Main Street. Some things will become higher priced. We will see some products actually, be raised in price because companies will pass on the cost of tariffs to consumers. I would expect that. That's why you have some people saying that we could see a recession. We'll see a growth slowdown.
For her to say that, big deal. Tensions within the Trump coalition bursting out into public view as Donald Trump loses his grip on the narrative that drove him back to the presidency. Is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With me at the table, executive editor and New York bureau chief for The Economist, Charlotte Howard's back, plus MSNBC political analyst, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller's here. Also joining us, former Congressional Budget Office director and American Action Forum president, Doug Holtz-Eakin is here. Doug, let me start with you. And just some economic basics. I liked what Joe Kernan said there. I think to talk to a Trump advisor and say, think tanks across the ideological spectrum have universally derided the policy, and it is non-serious, is sort of an attempt at public shaming. And I wonder what you think. It's been my conceit for 9 years that they have no shame.
Well, they certainly have not changed direction. So I don't know what you can bring to this argument. Is it additional data, the observations of foreign leaders, shaming, or, the economic conditions, higher inflation, perhaps a recession? I don't know what would change their mind. But certainly this is a very dangerous direction. A simple analogy is that we're working like mad to avoid a sunset of the 2017 tax law because it would be a tax increase of $400 billion next year, and that could cause a recession. He did that by himself last week. That's very dangerous, and it's something that ought to be unwound.
Well, let me argue it from the other side as someone who's been covering him for 9 years. I had the same feelings about weakening NATO by siding with Russia over Ukraine, and that didn't persuade them to not destroy NATO. Do people in the business world still think he'll be persuaded not to destroy the economic order?
I don't know what the evidence would be that would change his mind. He's got take the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. To what end? What is the benefit that those tariffs are supposed to produce for the United States? He's never enunciated any goal or objective for those. If they're negotiating ploys, what's he trying to negotiate? If there's some great trade misgiving there, I mean, what is it? What misdeed is in place? There is no articulation of that. So it's very difficult to have an argument with someone who hasn't laid out why they're doing what they're doing. They're just saying, I love the word tariffs, tariffs are good, and that's where we are.
Where do you think we're heading?
I think we are headed for a recession. I'm in that camp. I was concerned about the state of the economy prior to the announcement of the 10% universal tariff and the so-called reciprocal tariffs. Those are much too big for the current state of the economy to bear. And, the Federal Reserve probably can't rescue the economy at this point. So they'll do their best. My expectation is the economy will slow noticeably, that the Federal Reserve will cut rates to try to accommodate that and give up the fight on inflation. And we'll find the worst of both worlds. Rising unemployment, inflation reigns at a higher level than we like, and that's something that no American needed to go through. But that's likely where we are.
So, Charlotte, what's important about the Trump coalition, the sound that we played in the introduction,
sure,
seeing things get scary enough to sort of to say the things that Doug is saying. What is going to happen is what people warned would happen if tariffs on the scale were announced. There was a belief, there's always a belief that one, he can be talked out of doing a thing that hurts millions of Americans. Two, that there's anyone around him who can get to him or break through to him. I mean, his daughter didn't come back this time. That should dispel that rumor and misnomer once and for all. And three, that the bad thing that happened isn't the desired intent. How has the business community, Charlotte, changed what they think about the man over the last 4 days?
Well, I think inherent in your question is a gap between the way that anyone, whether a political analyst or a business person, would assess a conventional politician, which is to try to ascribe a strategy to something and try to ascribe norms. Who are the people within the White House who might exert influence over this person? Those are all conventional questions for how we think about evaluating a president and what he might do next. I think what I continue to be struck by in covering Donald Trump is that it's kind of like entering a lion's den and judging the lions on their table manners. Like you're taking an old framework to a situation where it's just completely non-applicable, right? And so I think that for the business community now, as we've heard, they're trying in a variety of ways, some public, like Bill Ackman talking about a nuclear economic winter, right, which is not, he's prone to hyperbole, but it's still quite a statement to the likes of business leaders.
Is that accurate? I mean, I don't know who he is other than a person who spends a lot of time on X, but is he a person who's made an accurate prediction of what the economy is going to do?
I think that if these tariffs take effect as they're slated to on tomorrow, April 9th, and if they last for a certain amount of time, I think it will cause great damage to the global economy, yes. I mean, Bill Ackman is someone who's an activist investor, right? So there's a certain amount of hyperbolic comms that's always part of an activist style. But I think in this case, it really is it's a grave warning, and it's one that is true. But you see business people, rather, trying to exert their influence, again, in all the conventional ways, but it's just not sticking.
So here's this, podcaster tent revival guy, right? With the merchandise branded with his name and the bottles of snake oil that he'll sell you and the children's books about Donald Trump being a king. That is who Donald Trump puts in charge of the FBI. When he gets there, he tells the agents of the FBI, essentially, hey, listen, don't worry, I know I'm an outsider, but I respect what you do enough that we're going to pick one of you guys, an experienced FBI agent, to be my deputy in running this place. Sure, maybe I'm just a podcaster, but we'll put somebody in here as my number two who you'll really trust. And then does he do that? No, he does not. He hires instead, as the deputy director of the FBI, another podcaster. This burly man, whose whole kind of brand as a podcaster is that he's kind of burly. His whole shtick is man in tight t-shirt, talks about fighting a lot, and makes a lot of melodrama about the importance of physical toughness and being willing to die heroically for the cause. And of course, the cause is the greatness and infallibility of Donald Trump. Wow, does he love that guy? But he means it only in the manliest way possible. Look at these arms. It's like his whole shtick. So Kash Patel, podcaster, names this other podcaster guy to be deputy director of the FBI instead of actually hiring anyone with FBI experience. But now that deputy director, he too has started on the job. And how is that going so far? Headline: FBI creates multi-agent bodyguard team to protect Dan Bongino. The former pro-Trump podcaster is the first deputy director to have a security detail. Full-time protection could require up to 20 agents, former officials said. Quote, in a break from past practice, in which the Bureau's number 2 officials have not had security details, the FBI has now issued a call for agents to serve as bodyguards for Deputy Director Dan Bongino. The FBI canvass sought agents willing to relocate for 30 days of temporary duty to protect Dan Bongino 24 hours a day. Full-time protection could require as many as 20 agents. The previous deputy director was assigned a single agent part-time to accompany him to certain events. He had a full detail only when he traveled overseas. In contrast, though, now, 2 former FBI officials familiar with the matter said Dan Bongino's current bodyguards have followed him inside secure FBI facilities, including headquarters in Washington. They said directors typically walk around FBI headquarters without their security details. But not this deputy director, not this podcaster. He wants the full 24 hours, 20-man team surrounding him at all times, including while he's walking around inside the FBI building. Because, what? Like spiders? Creaking sounds? Is there any chance you just hate to be alone? I mean, we are in this everything must go moment, right? In this administration, we can no longer fund libraries or museums. We must stop our work on multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis and drug-resistant gonorrhea. We are closing the Head Start offices. We are firing the meteorologists who produce weather forecasts. We are firing the people who answer the phones at the Social Security office. We are firing tens of thousands of people who work with veterans at the VA. We are shutting the U.S. Department of Education because everything must go. It's all waste. It's all waste. It all has to go because we, the taxpayers, must pay for Kash Patel's new drapes in his office, his nice new decor that he demanded on day one, and also the cost of him, what was that phrase, of him spending, what was the quote? Quote, a lot of time in Las Vegas, where he won't even be enjoying the new drapes. Also, we have to pay for his deputy director, Dan Bongino, the podcaster with the arms. We'll be paying for him to be surrounded at all times by a full-time phalanx of a 20-man team of bodyguards who stay with him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, like, while he sleeps, they can sit and watch him. And while he's inside the FBI headquarters building at work inside, they will be there surrounding him in case, like, he has to get up and go potty or something. There's a team that can take him. But it's not only Trump's guys at the FBI. Headline: the cabinet secretary who wants his cookies freshly baked. Trump administration Interior Secretary Doug Burgum likes chocolate chip cookies, preferably freshly baked and still warm. This peculiar fact became the talk of the Department of the Interior in recent weeks after his chief of staff made an unusual request of staff in his office. Quote, learn to regularly bake cookies for Secretary Burgum and his guests using the industrial ovens at the department headquarters. That request was not the only move by his team that has alarmed some Interior officials. 4 people familiar with Burgum's leadership told The Atlantic that those who run Burgum's office have repeatedly made unusual demands to his employees. His office leadership, for example, once instructed political appointees to act as servers for a multi-course meal. They also did, like waiters, they made them into waiters. They also dispatched a U.S. Park Police helicopter for his personal transportation. On at least one occasion, a political appointee was told to remake the cookies because the batch was subpar, according to 3 people. The Atlantic has 3 sources on the Interior Department staff member being told to rebake the cookies for the secretary. What'd they do with the old cookies? What was wrong with them? Is there anything you could do to cookies that would be that bad? Now, there are sources from the Department of Interior that are defending Secretary Burgum here, noting explicitly in their pushback to The Atlantic that staff members are not required to make this cookie dough themselves. It is store-bought cookie dough that they only need to bake. So ease up, people. Quote, Burgum has also used the political appointees in his department for another purpose in recent days, stacking firewood in his office's fireplace. Burgum also reportedly demands, quote, that any labels get removed from water bottles before they are delivered to him. Or else. I mean, the man obviously cannot remove the labels from his own water bottles. That must be done by other government employees, people on the payroll paid by the taxpayers, because I mean, think about it. Honestly, if the secretary himself was occupied removing his own water bottle labels, he might not get to the cookies in time. And then who would send them back, demanding that they were not warm enough and they must be rebaked? The secretary is in charge of some really specific stuff. Tell me more about your Department of Government Efficiency. I mean, at the National Park Service, they're firing the rangers and the maintenance crews and scientists by the thousands. But Park Service helicopters, including the staff that fly them and maintain them, they're being diverted to pop Secretary warm cookies around town when he's in a rush. You know, honestly, it's so much nicer than sitting in traffic. Quote, the aviation unit of the U.S. Park Police, a division of the Department of the Interior, does not routinely handle VIP transport, according to a U.S. Park Police fact sheet. The blue and white helicopters launched to provide additional aerial surveillance during presidential and other dignitary movements and are used for medevac, search and rescue, high-risk prisoner transport, and to support law enforcement operations. And also to make sure he is there in time for the cookies to still be warm, or they are going back. Do it again!
In less than 24 hours, the Trump administration has gone from potentially being held in contempt of court for not following a judge's orders regarding the return of deported Venezuelan migrants to being told by the Supreme Court that it could continue to deport migrants under the Wartime Alien Enemies Act. Now, while the administration is claiming victory, the highest court did add that detainees must be afforded due process and given time to challenge their detentions before they're taken out of the country. That was not afforded to the 200-plus migrants on the initial flights last month to the notorious El Salvador prison, where they remain tonight, folks. Rejoining me now is MSNBC legal analyst and former acting assistant attorney general for national security, Mary McCord. Mary, I want to start out of the gate with a sound from the White House press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, being asked about the Supreme Court ruling regarding deportees. Just take a listen.
With regards to the Supreme Court ruling on the Alien Enemies Act, you're right. It was a win for the administration, but the justices also said that deportees are entitled to due process. Does the administration agree with that?
That's not quite true, Gabe. They said that they are entitled to a habeas petition, and we are going to continue to comply with the law, and we are wholly confident that every single person that has been deported under the Alien Enemies Act, every person that will continue to be deported under the Alien Enemies Act qualifies for that deportation.
So, Mary, I was not a criminal lawyer, corporate lawyer, so I look at this a little bit differently, and I'll admit, but at least my reading of the Constitution, my understanding of the law, is that habeas corpus, we have the body, means the state now has got legal possession of you, still requires due process. So, Caroline, if you're watching, Caroline,
Not sure where she got her law degree, but I think she's misinterpreting the Supreme Court. And there's a number of things here. All 9 justices agreed that the deportees are entitled to habeas corpus, meaning a procedure to have notice that they're being deported under the Alien Enemies Act and have the opportunity to challenge that. Not just to challenge whether they're members of Tren de Aragua, they certainly have that right, but also to challenge the use of the Alien Enemies Act in this way as a basis for deporting members of this alleged gang. The other thing I would say is this still does not absolve the administration from potential contempt, right? Mm-hmm. Because even though the Supreme Court has now said they have not ruled on the applicability of the Alien Enemies Act, they've only said the proper forum is habeas corpus, not an Administrative Procedure Act claim in front of Judge Boasberg, because that was that claim and under the Administrative Procedures Act. It's like this is the wrong cause of action in the wrong place. So you've got to use habeas. You've got to do it in the jurisdiction where you're detained. And so I'll come to that. So those who haven't been deported yet, many of them are in Texas. They could be in other places. They have a right. But that does not absolve the administration from violating, if it did violate, Judge Boasberg's orders on March 15th, because then courts have been clear, including the Supreme Court, even if ultimately a judge's order is overruled, you don't get to violate it when you disagree with it. You have to appeal it. So he can still keep up these hearings to determine, what he's going to do if and when he determines they were in contempt. And the other point I would make is that even though some 140 or so people were already deported to the El Salvadoran Terrorist Detention Center, they still would now have rights to seek habeas, and they're no longer in Texas. And my understanding is, by law, those habeas, when you are outside the country, can be brought in D.C. So they may find themselves right back in the federal court in D.C.
What's happening with these folks? Is there anybody representing them at all? Folks, what we've witnessed is our government rounded up these 200-plus people, did not process them the right way at all. So they have no idea who they got. All they know is they're Venezuelan, they have Hispanic.
Tattoos.
Yeah, right. Hispanic surnames, and that was enough. Mm-hmm. So who's now advocating through the judicial process to get habeas for them, to get due process for them, because they seem to be forgotten in all of this right now.
And I think that's one of the major problems with habeas as a remedy. And to be clear, I don't think the court was right about habeas as the only remedy, and neither do the 4 dissenters. Or at least they think it's a hard question whether habeas is the right remedy versus the Administrative Procedure Act, and they shouldn't have taken it on this emergency docket, right? And that's what the 4 dissenters say as well. But even if habeas is the right way, it's so difficult. I'm not sure anybody knows. The government hasn't disclosed exactly who was on those planes under the authority of Alien Enemies Act. It's one of the things Judge Boasberg's been trying to get to the bottom of. Who were those people? Where's the list? I'm sure families maybe have started to figure out, and then they've got to find a lawyer who's willing to file the habeas petition, etc. There can be class action habeas, so maybe that's something that can take place, but I can guarantee that the immigration lawyers who work on these kind of matters have probably been scrambling ever since this opinion came out last night.
Trying to figure out how to get them in front. I got one more.
Catherine, even this morning, though, the Treasury Secretary sort of struggled to explain the end game of this tariff agenda. How much does the message ultimately matter here? Does it change the economics?
What matters here is what they actually do. We've heard a lot of mixed messaging from this administration, whether the tariffs are temporary as part of a negotiating ploy, which is a narrative that the Treasury Secretary seemed to endorse today, which, again, I think is why markets are rallying. Or are they permanent because we need the revenue, because they're part of Trump's grand plan to restructure global trade and bring manufacturing back into the United States? Now, I am dubious that any of those achievements that I just mentioned will actually happen as a result of keeping the tariffs permanent. But either way, they would be very devastating to the U.S. economy, to the global economy, to consumer living standards, et cetera. So the messaging needs to be a little more coherent, but ultimately what matters is finding an off-ramp to this needless global trade war.
And Justin, we've all been on the roller coaster the last few days watching Wall Street and reacting to the recent market turmoil. Here's what White House senior trade counselor Peter Navarro said on Fox last night.
It's going to be companies in the S&P 500 who are the first to produce here. Those are the ones going to lead the recovery. And it's going to happen. Dow 50,000, I guarantee that. And I guarantee no recession, okay?
Dow 50,000. We're not even at 40,000 today. No recession, he's guaranteeing. That's obviously the message the Trump administration wants out there. But this new CNBC survey of CEOs found 69% expect a recession. Justin, I have to put you on the spot because after the pandemic, you were right on when you kept saying the U.S. was not headed for a recession. Where do you stand right now?
It's hard, but let me give you actually two forecasts. If Trump backs down, throws it all away, says I made a mistake, let's move on, we're going to do coherent economic policy, there's been a little bit of damage, and I think there's only a 25% chance of a recession this year. If he keeps on the current path, we're all the way up to a 75% chance, and most of my economist friends tell me that's me being optimistic. If he'd done nothing at all, this normally in a typical year there's a 12 or 13% chance of a recession. This year is actually a wonderful year for doing business. There's not much chaos around the world. It should have been 10%. It's definitely 25%. If he stays the course, we're up to 75%.
So is there a door number 3 here, though, if he keeps giving mixed messages and everyone is in this permanent wait-and-see uncertainty mode, then what?
Well, I can tell you about my family. We're thinking about buying a second car, but with the tariffs, car prices are way up. Now, I don't reckon he's going to stay the course, so why would I pay a lot of money for a car right now? So I'm going to wait a few months to see whether he backs off. Well, that's what I'm doing. I reckon there's a lot of other families doing the same thing. Talk to any CEO across the country and they're telling you the same thing. If their staff brings you expansion plans, a new factory, something like that, the level of uncertainty, not just about trade, but about the entire Trump agenda is so high that for them, surely the best answer is, let me put this in the drawer for a couple of months and see how things shake out. If everyone does that at the same time, that causes spending to plummet, and that's the thing that starts the recession.
Brian, these claims that there are dozens of countries trying to negotiate with the White House right now. Here was the Treasury Secretary this morning on CNBC.
My advice on April 2nd to our trading partners was not to panic, don't escalate, and then we will see where President Trump is after a period of days or weeks. I think you are going to see some very large countries with large trade deficits come forward very quickly. I think we can, if they come to the table with solid proposals, I think we can end up with some good deals.
Brian, do we know what kind of concessions the White House is wanting?
Well, it's more than just lowering their tariff rates. And we heard it from Peter Navarro, again, the trade advisor to President Trump yesterday when he spoke on another network and offered the theory where he said even if a country like Vietnam were to offer a 0% tariff rate on U.S. goods that are imported into Vietnam, that wouldn't be enough. He wants things like concessions on intellectual property, some sort of explicit promise from countries like Vietnam and maybe other Southeast Asian countries as well that they won't allow China to export products through those Southeast Asian countries to avoid a higher tariff. It's a little bit unclear about how they would do that. I want to point out here, though, when we talk about the tariffs and the language around this, right, or especially around the word reciprocal, it wasn't ever really about the tariff rates that other countries charge on the United States as well, because when you unpack and you look at the actual formula for how the White House calculated their so-called reciprocal tariffs, there is nothing in that equation that accounts for the actual tariff rate that another country charges. All it is essentially is the trade deficit. It accounts singularly for what is the difference between the amount that another country brings in from the United States and how much they send to the U.S. So, that equation and the framing of all this as, oh, it's a reciprocal tariff, we are tariffing back on another country half of what they charge us, that's just outright false. And I think even the label of reciprocal it needs to be rethought here. But it's not just about the tariff rate, it's about other concessions like intellectual property like the way that they interact with the Chinese government and the Chinese economy. Those are all very complicated things to try and negotiate bilaterally with each of the countries that we might now ratchet up rates on.
Yeah, and Justin, speaking of China, that is a country that doesn't appear to be looking for a deal right now. They have threatened to, quote, fight till the end. If neither side backs down here, we're talking 104% tariffs from the U.S. on Chinese goods and likely vice versa. What is the fallout of that? Detail what that looks like for the American consumer and American jobs.
Well, so much of what we buy, I looked at my kids' toys last night. So many of them were made in China. I looked at the clothes that I wear. So many of them are made in China. You might say, why don't you buy American, Justin? They almost don't make it in America. You might say, well, why don't we onshore it to America, Justin? But we don't want those jobs. Do you really want your kids growing up to be stitching in a sweatshop? Do you want them working in a plastics factory? So that's the big thing. We're basically going to be completely cut off from China. Your iPhone, it's currently built in China. So two things are going to happen there. Either the price of the iPhone will rise dramatically, by some estimates over $2,000, or we saw Apple already figure out the smartest way to get around these tariffs. It's not to bring production to America. They're going to start producing more in India instead. Doesn't help Americans, raises the price of the phone, hurts China, helps India. I don't know how it's helping any of us.
You make some really, really good points, and I think we're all just trying to make sense of what it means for our families. Catherine, we're about to hear from the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and that's going to happen in just minutes. We're seeing the heads of the Finance Committee deliver their opening statements. Of course, we will bring any highlights to our viewers once that really gets going, but we do know that Greer is expected to say that the tariffs are already bearing fruit. What questions does Greer need to answer?
Well, a number of things. So as you just heard from Brian, if we are actually trying to get concessions from other countries along the lines of protecting our intellectual property rights or not doing deals with China, we had a deal like this negotiated under one of Greer's predecessors, Michael Froman, under former President Obama, called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was a multilateral trade agreement that did all of those things, essentially. And Trump tore it up very early in his first term. So one question is this really the best strategy for achieving any of the objectives we have heard the Trump administration mention they want to achieve, particularly reining in China, opening up markets to U.S. exporters, et cetera? Another one would be, how did they come up with this nonsense formula that Brian mentioned earlier for the quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs, which, again, that's a propaganda term. This has nothing to do with reciprocity. It's an arbitrary formula that was chosen that basically divides the trade deficit by the number of imports from that other country. It has nothing to do with trade barriers. We import a lot of vanilla from Madagascar because that's where the vanilla is grown. We import coffee from lots of countries that have sort of more jungle-like climates because that's where coffee is grown. Has nothing to do with trade barriers. So one question is, where did this formula come from? Because right now I am hearing from members of this administration that no one wants to take credit or blame, rather, for it once it was pointed out what an embarrassment it was.
Catherine Rampell, Brian Cheung, Justin Wolfers, thank you all so much for joining us, helping us make sense of how this is unfolding.